Hi, my name is April, and this is High Fantasy Writing. Most of my previous videos have focused on critiquing advice or specific writing advice. I just watched Netflix's Shadow and Bone, which is actually a great adaptation of some YA novels, and I felt like it was so out of the ordinary that I really wanted to make some videos about it. Now, I had intended this to be a single video about why I personally felt that the adaptation in Netflix's TV, very bingeable series was actually better than the books themselves, and how that came about. What did the Shadow and Bone TV series do differently than the book that made them stand out more than the actual book did? Because we kind of all know that whole little meme of the book is better. The book is always better than the adaptation. And seeing Shadow and Bone, after not particularly enjoying the trilogy of Shadow and Bone that Leigh Bardugo had written, I was very shocked to see how much I loved this TV series, and I wanted to break it down for you. But that I started writing the script for it, and it just got longer and longer and longer because there's so many things to talk about, so many things that I can point to show how much better the Netflix series portrayed characters in its storytelling than the books did, that really made it stand out above the rest. So this is actually going to be a series of a couple of videos about kind of analyzing the books and the TV show. And then at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I want from the future of this Netflix series, because I don't see why Netflix wouldn't pick this up for a second, third, fourth, fifth season. Because even if we fully encapsulate the trilogy, because this first season followed the books of the first book in the Shadow and Bone trilogy. So we already naturally have 3 seasons, one for each book. The Six of Crows characters can then have their own 2 seasons, and it'll be great. So look forward to the future videos about that. But in this one in particular, I want to give you guys a sort of baseline of where I'm at coming from the books, how I feel about those, and then actually how I feel about the series, and a few broad strokes about why I feel like the series did it better than the books. Now, it is extraordinarily rare that the adaptation of a book, a manga, and animated series actually is received critically much better than the original. This is especially true when we're talking about young adult fantasy. The Twilight movies, back when I was in high school, ushered in a huge wave of adaptations for YA books. And then the Hunger Games really took that to the next level. And I believe the Hunger Games was the most critically successful and successful adaptations of YA books in this whole wave of adaptations that came about during that time period. Now, many more adaptations came onto the picture and desperately were vying for the next Hunger Games place in the pantheon. But I don't believe any of them came even close to the Hunger Games' popularity and quality of adaptation. As many of us are aware, and some of us painfully lived through, we know that many of these adaptations weren't just not as good as the book, but they were actually kind of painfully not good at all. This also didn't help that the Hunger Games books ushered in a wave of young writers desperate to put their stamp on the writing industry and kind of ride the wave of young adult dystopian futures with the books not even being as successful as the Hunger Games, the books not even being as high of quality as the Hunger Games. So naturally, their adaptations didn't do well at all. I think that maybe part of this is due to the producers and directors of the films when adapting them. They didn't really take the time to think about how they could change some aspects of the original book that wasn't too good to begin with to make it even better and make it work better for screen. Now, many of these adaptations also didn't have the greatest budget, and when they did have a large budget, it wasn't used. Let's just say the viewer couldn't see where the budget had gone to. I'm looking at you, Shyamalan movie that shall not be named. Now, these fantasy adaptations quickly fell off in favor of more contemporary romance-style YA fiction, a lot of them actually kind of focusing on illness-related romances, kind of glorifying illnesses or making it the big thing to be talked about in these adaptations. And this was, I feel like, a natural step for the filmmaking industry because these contemporaries were set in our own world. There wasn't magic in these stories that needed to have any special effects budget put into them. They just happened in our world. You just get a set of a house and voila, you've got it. You don't have to make the little fire effects. You don't have to make a new world and make people watching it feel like they're no longer on our Earth in this time period. So the contemporaries took off a lot more, but I don't believe anybody truly thought that the movie adaptations were as good as the books. Now, this left us fantasy fans with only things that were more adult-centered, like Game of Thrones. And for people who weren't really into the more adult themes of torture, rape, and graphic sexual scenes, we were kind of left out of the market in this time period. Now, there were amazing comic book fantasy stories going on, especially with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but those are a very particular style of fantasy, and in the Marvel's case, it's very centered on Earth rather than a fantastical land that is completely made up. We did get some time spent in Asgard with the Thor movies or in space with Guardians of the Galaxy, but it never really scratched that itch that I feel like a lot of fantasy fans got back in our childhoods when we read things and watched things like The Lord of the Rings, and then read Chronicles of Narnia and The Wheel of Time, these big epic fantasies that have their own worlds with their own histories, their own political subplots, their own magic systems, and their own legends and myths that went along with the stories. We were really left out of the media, television and movies. Now, I don't know if the success of the first seasons of Game of Thrones was what led Netflix to actually pick up Shadow and Bone and actually give it a good budget. Like, who knew we would actually get a budget for a YA fantasy story that kind of heavily hinges, at least the books and the fandom in the books, heavily hinged on the romantic aspect of the books, which I will talk about later. But I am absolutely thankful for whatever led the Netflix producers and people in charge over there to say, you know what? Yeah, let's give this fantasy YA world a chance. So here we are, in the long, at least in entertainment terms, dead genre of YA fantasy adaptations on Netflix, one of the biggest streaming sites, if not the biggest streaming site, with original content. And it's actually a good adaptation? Now, when the Shadow and Bone adaptation was announced, I didn't really pay it much attention. I just saw a little news article about it, said, huh, okay then, and then continued on with my life. I didn't really love the Shadow and Bone trilogy. I was much more interested in the duology, The Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom, that came out in the same world after the Shadow and Bone trilogy. So I wasn't really thinking that I would enjoy the adaptation much. Like I said before, the shipping wars between people completely shitting on Melina, which is Mal and Alina getting together, and people absolutely wetting themselves over Darklina, which is the Darkling, and Alina getting together, that was really what I remembered from the stories and seeing it on like booktube and things like that. That was really all I thought about when I thought about the Shadow and Bone trilogy, was this huge shipping war where the majority of people shipped something that I did not and absolutely shit on the one thing that I did actually support. And so that was the taste in my mouth when I left the trilogy of Shadow and Bone. So I wasn't really interested in seeing a cheesy romantic YA thing where we're gonna really focus on the romance between the Darkling and Alina, because I just personally wasn't interested in that. And now, after seeing the series, I kind of look back in a horror that I didn't immediately watch it as soon as it came out. In my birth month of April, I could have had this like 1 week after my birthday, and I was like, nah, I'm good. Like, it's not something that I'm really itching to watch, to potentially be very disappointed in and possibly cringe at the low quality of storytelling. I genuinely didn't even consider watching it until I saw a whole bunch of really good reviews coming out. Like, YouTubers who I pretty much trust with their opinions on adaptations and TV shows were saying, hey, this is actually a good adaptation. This is actually really good. And I kind of sat there. I just looked at the thumbnails. I didn't want to taint my opinion at all before going in. I didn't want to get any spoilers because I had kind of heard a little bit that characters from the Six of Crows series were going to be showing up in it, and that's it. I didn't want to know how they were going to do it. I didn't want to know much before going in. But them actually saying, hey, this is really good, seeing these good reviews, I started thinking, is this too good to be true? Is this actually going to be a good fantasy adaptation that is not filled with gratuitous torture, rape, and sex scenes randomly that I do not feel are necessary to the plot, to the story, to the character development, or anything? Is this actually going to be a good adaptation in a setting that I truly love? I loved this setting in the books. I didn't particularly enjoy the plot or characters in the books, but the setting I found to have so much potential. And was this something in the fantasy genre that I could enjoy that wasn't a comic book movie? And more importantly, could this show fix all of the issues that I had with the books? And how would they incorporate the characters from Six of Crows into the Shadow and Bone story when they never meet in the books? I was insanely curious. Have I prejudged something that I should not have prejudged? I'm gonna watch this. Also, seeing that Ben Barnes was the Darkling, it didn't hurt the series' chances. It really didn't. So, I watched. I binged. Oh my goodness, I just binged the entire thing in a single night. Like, it was 4 a.m. by the time I actually went to sleep, because I just watched one episode and the next, and then I was like, no, I need to keep watching. And then by like episode 6. I was like, I might as well just finish the entire thing. So, needless to say, I was immediately hooked. After watching and absolutely loving Netflix's Shadow and Bone series, I was consumed with the need to pick it apart and figure out why I loved the TV series so much more than I did the books. So needless to say, all of this is my own personal opinion. You can absolutely disagree with me. You can feel like the books were better than the show. You can think that some of the changes they made in the show you didn't like that I did like. It's all up to opinion, but I want you guys to see where my mind is and how my mind breaks down these storytelling and character developmental changes and why I feel that some worked better in the show and some things that I kind of wish they had have kept from the books and put into the show. But I feel like many of the fans of the Grishaverse, and Leigh Bardugo herself probably, would agree that now that she has had time to grow as an author, going back to these first books of hers and reworking some things, collaborating with the writers and producers of the show, really was a great idea to bring new life to this old story of hers. I think that now Bardugo can see, since this was one of her first books, that there's so much more that Bardugo has to offer to this particular story that now she's able to explore. So this is just a little video that is going to be extraordinarily long about how I believe that the writing in the Shadow and Bone TV series by Netflix actually elevated the story and was better than the books. And hopefully this can help you if you're a writer about, one, being okay with having collaborators come in and help you with your story, change up some things if you are lucky enough to have gotten like a TV or a movie adaptation deal. Congratulations, and maybe this will put you a little bit at ease that there was actually a good adaptation. And maybe if you are nowhere near that stage, but you are a little bit afraid of other people coming in and suggesting changes, maybe seeing how changes from the original story are better in the collaborated version can help you kind of release a little bit of that creative control and look to making your story the best that it can be, even if that does include critique partners or people who really come in and change a good deal of your work. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I didn't particularly enjoy the Shadow and Bone trilogy. I was actually quite harsh with it on Goodreads when I read it back in 2017. I rated the first book 3 stars though. So I was a lot harsher in my actual review than I was with my grading, because I felt like there was so much potential in this world, in this story that Leigh Bardugo was beginning to tell. So even though it actually took me about 200 pages to actually decide, okay, no, I'm not going to DNF this book, I feel like the latter half of the book really piqued my interest in continuing the story. So I really loved the flavor of the world that Bardugo set up. It was fantasy, which I love, but it was a later period, so there were rifles, there was more machinery, it was more advanced than the typical swords and bow and arrows that you see in many fantasies. And I really loved the Russian influence, and that's not something we see a lot in fantasy. Most of the time, it's like England, Arthurian type of setting that we're in when we're in fantasy. But I absolutely loved the different flavor that she had, because she also included the Shuhan, which is more Mongolian Chinese inspired, and Fjerda, which is the country to the north, which is much more Scandinavian inspired. Now, we don't get a whole bunch of the Shuhan actually in any of the books, but for her to have those not as common in especially YA fantasy settings was really refreshing, and I really wanted to see where she was going to go with it. Now, while I really loved the world that she was setting up, I felt that the characters and the plot were extremely lacking. I do lay most of the blame at the feet of her using first person point of view only from Alina's perspective. We did not bounce around to anybody else in any other chapters except for the prologue and the epilogue, but those still followed Alina and Mal. It was just told from third person omniscient point of view. But we didn't get to see anybody else's thought process, and we didn't get to see what anybody else was doing if they weren't in the room with Alina. And I don't really blame Bardugo too much for this, because first person point of view is incredibly difficult to do well, and especially when you're in a fantasy world that is completely new, it is very difficult to have an intricate plot when you only see things from one person's point of view. And I think Bardugo saw this because in her next books, The Duology of the Six of Crows, she changed to third person limited perspective, and she had points of view of multiple characters. It's pretty much a consensus among fans of the Grishaverse stories that the Duology of Six of Crows is much more well received than the trilogy of the Shadow and Bone series. And I believe that pretty much people kind of agree that, well, number one, the characters are very different. It's a very different tone of books, but being able to see it from many points of view makes the plot and the setting much broader, and you're able to latch on much more than when it's just single person, first person point of view. So, continuing my feelings on the Shadow and Bone book, I kind of hated Alina. I kind of really hated Alina. So, this was written in the kind of boom of the I'm not like other girls phase, and the we have to have a love triangle. There has to be a nice guy who is the same age as the protagonist, who is very kind to her, who has been the long time friend, and then the mysterious older man who is some sort of supernatural being. This was a very large trope in the books of the time, and boy, did this book fall into it hard. So right in the prologue, one of the people at the orphanage straight up says, Alina is not like other girls. Just flat out, straight up, no bones about it. We are going for the she is not like other girls trope. And I don't like that trope, because I don't even know what it means. Like, what do you mean? Alina, what type of girl are you looking at as this is the stereotype of all girls? Well, I'll tell you, it's the stereotype that Leigh Bardugo has for every single other female character in the book. They're vain, they're shallow, they are bitchy. And every single female character that you meet in Shadow and Bone is that to a T, and that is their only personality traits. Everyone is the exact same. And that was another thing I hated, was all the side characters were so bland. They were just gray masses of people, because we were so wrapped up in Alina's head. Alina, I guess, just didn't care about anybody but herself. And so we don't actually get any depth in any of the side characters. And there was so much girl hate, with every single girl being the bad type of girl that Alina Starkov definitely wasn't, that I almost DNF'd the book. I was like, there is way too much girl hate. There is no difference in any of these girls. Instead of having it be like oh, well, Alina thinks that she's not like other girls, but then she realizes that other girls actually have depth. Who'da thunk it? Leigh Bardugo did not go that route, and she decided to say, yes, all girls are shitty, and Alina was right to not want to be like them. And it's like, come on. I also felt that the plot was lacking a lot. There wasn't a lot going on in the plot until the very, very end of the book, so it kind of drug in places, and I was like, well, it really would have helped if we could see some plot lines from other people happening. That could have helped. Wonder why the show is what I like better. But I was quite critical of the first book in the Shadow and Bone trilogy, especially when I rated it on Goodreads. I also didn't like in the book when I first read it that the Darkling did turn out to be evil in the end. In the middle, I had thought that she was going to go a different direction, a direction that I would have found much, much more interesting than him just being like, yeah, he's named the Darkling. He has powers over darkness. Everyone in the kingdom thinks that he is an evil guy. Everyone is scared of him. He is the leader of the military. He is a bad guy. And yeah, he's a bad guy. Yeah, he's the villain. He's just flat evil. Yeah, that's what he is. I really thought that she was going to not go that route, and that she was going to play with the idea of, yes, he has the powers of shadow. Yes, he is very intimidating to other people. He might be a little bit aloof because of this amount of power that he has, but he actually has good intentions. Now, he didn't have to be a perfect character. He didn't even have to be a heroic character, but have him be something like an anti-hero or somebody who does bad things but for really good reasons would have been more interesting to me than having him flip a switch seemingly in our eyes, because all we can see is Alina's perspective, and she was all gaga eyes over him. So at a flip of a switch, all of a sudden he is just straight evil, trying to enslave Alina and destroy the world. Like, I had wanted something different. Now, with some time and hearing Leigh Bardugo speaking about how she really, really wanted to show that this relationship with the Darkling was an abusive one, and that even abusive people can be charming. They can have more going on than their abuse. You can be attracted to them. That doesn't mean they're not abusers and it's not an abusive relationship. You still need to be able to recognize that abuse, even when the guy's hot and sexy Ben Barnes, you know? Now, like I said in my review, after all of these complaints, you might say, well, why'd you rate it 3 stars then if you hated it so much? Because I really did see a lot of potential in it. I did love the world that Bardugo was setting up, and I saw that there were a lot of really interesting places that we could go with this story. And at the very end, Alina makes a decision that I just latched onto, and I was like, yes, this is what I want. This is what I like. This is interesting. Which sadly did not make it into the show. But that's a gripe for another day, or the end of this video. So in the end, I did feel like there was a lot of potential for this story, and potential for it to get better in later books. Now, how did I feel about the Netflix's Shadow and Bone series? I was immediately engrossed in the world. Actually seeing it in front of me rather than just reading it was incredible. They did such a phenomenal job on the set design, the costume design, the acting was phenomenal. I don't have words for how well every single one of the actors portrayed their characters. It was better than I could have even hoped, the way they portrayed their characters. So, kudos to you, casting director. Kudos to you. As outstanding of quality as many Netflix shows are, like Daredevil, Jessica Jones, things like that, they have much smaller budgets because they're much more grounded, down to earth. You don't have to create an entire shadow fold. You're in New York City. You can just walk into New York City with a camera and say, "Action, Charlie Cox." Act like Matt Murdock. And that costs a lot less then creating a shadow fold, creating Volcra, making magic effects. And so it was so strange and a wonderful surprise for me seeing this level of quality in a Netflix show that's fantasy. So I almost got that feeling of Lord of the Rings again with the sweeping shots, and you truly feel like you're in a different world. None of the areas in the show ever felt like they were just a set that was slapped up really quickly. They all truly felt like I was in Ketterdam. In the Six of Crows character scenes, like I felt like I was in a whole different city. There were so many different sets in that city that were so different, and yet had the through line of the sepia, the sepia, all the rain, always in the dark. But it's Ketterdam. That's exactly what you imagine Ketterdam to be. A city where there is no daytime. It's always nighttime in Ketterdam, and it's always raining. It was so, so cool. Like the little palace. It felt like you were in a palace. It didn't feel like they just walked up to a cool building they had found in Budapest, and then now we're in a soundstage. It didn't feel like that to me personally when I was watching it. And so the quality of the setting, it just blew me away, especially since this is a fantasy. And sometimes, especially articles of clothing in fantasy, you can't really picture, like the keftas. I had no idea what they looked like. Not a clue. They were coats. And I'm like, surely it's more than a coat. But I had no idea what a kefta that was for a Grisha might look like. And I got that in the show. It really engrossed me and put me in this world in a way that the books just simply didn't. One of the main things that I just loved and just elevated the storytelling so much in the Netflix series was that we got to see things away from Alina. We didn't have to stay in Alina's head. We actually got to see the Darkling and Mal specifically acting away from Alina. We got to see what they were like when they weren't either as the Darkling trying to impress Alina and get her on his side, and Mal not being super protective in the moment of Alina because he saw her so little in the books. We actually got to see that Mal really cared about Alina outside of her powers. A big complaint in the books that other people brought up was that they thought that Mal truly didn't care about Alina until she got powers and she got all popular, and then they were like, oh, he only started caring about her then. But that was just because we were seeing Mal from Alina's point of view. And Alina at that point was so self-depreciating that she could not imagine that anything Mal was doing was because he truly liked her. She just thought of him as like, well, he's just gonna hang out with me because we knew each other as kids, but he doesn't actually like me. In the show, we actually get to see things from his perspective, from the Darkling's perspective, and it just broadens the world a whole lot more, and things that actually were happening in the books, like Mal's whole hunt for the stag, and him writing Alina letters every day. We actually got to see them instead of having them relegated to a single paragraph in the books that is quickly glossed over so that they can go hunt the stag again. I also really loved how they changed the races of many of the characters. In the books, everyone is white. I think it's in like King of Scars, which I haven't read yet. King of Scars and Rule of Wolves is the duology that takes place after the Six of Crows duology, and I just haven't gotten around to reading it. But I believe it follows Nikolai and Zoya, and in that, I believe it's revealed that Zoya is actually half Suli. And I believe that was kind of a retcon of Bardugo's when she kind of wrote the story and then realized, I haven't been very inclusive in my stories. I haven't been inclusive of a lot of races or religions in my stories, so maybe I should change that up a bit, which is great. I love it when authors grow. But when I read the books, they were all white. So in the TV show, I absolutely love how they made Alina half Shu and how they made Zoya and Mal half Suli. Now, Zoya being half Suli doesn't really come up much. It's only, you'd only catch things if you knew that she was half Suli. It's never explicitly told in the show, nor is Mal being half Suli. I actually was really confused when there were some flashbacks to the orphanage, and a kid is bullying Mal and Alina, and he calls Alina a rice eater, which is a slur for her being part Shu. But then he also called Mal a half breed, also a slur for somebody who's mixed race. And I didn't really understand, like, is he talking to Mal? Is he talking to Alina? Because it's actually never explicitly stated in the show that Mal is half Suli, which I thought that was a really interesting choice, and actually kind of nice that you didn't have to explicitly be like, and this character is this race, and this character is this race. It was actually kind of cool that it was just an underlying thing that did affect the story. It did affect the characters and how they perceived themselves and how others perceived them, but it didn't have to be this big thing. It was just, this is who they are, this is their race, and how are they going to handle that in the story. And I really appreciated it. This also includes Nadia being a woman of color rather than just white like she is in the books. And the last thing, probably the most obvious thing, is that they included characters from the Six of Crows duology into this story when they obviously were not in the book of Shadow and Bone. I thought that including their story was a genius move because Alina's story is very high fantasy, very I am the chosen one here to save the world, with very heavy, serious tones. There's not much humor in the Shadow and Bone trilogy, and though the Six of Crows characters are all morally gray and are doing sometimes terrible things, they're literally out to hurt people sometimes. Like, that's literally their job, is to be like, kidnap this person or torture this person for information, and they're like, okay. They actually lightened the tone a lot because they had great chemistry, they're funny characters, and they have so much personality that it was a great break from the big, heavy, we have to save the world themes of Alina's story. The Six of Crows characters are just great big messes who are super skilled at what they do, and they were a fantastic inclusion in the Shadow and Bone TV show. Now, this isn't to say that I didn't have some issues with the changes that they made from the book to the TV series. I actually did have a couple of things that I was like, would have rather they didn't do that. I felt like in the show, Alina's time at the Little Palace was massively glossed over. Now, in the books, it did take a lot of time, but seeing it completely cut down in the show to only 2 episodes really did make it seem like Alina just immediately got her powers, and as soon as she unlocked that thing she needed to unlock, she was just perfect at using her powers. She didn't need to practice at all, which in the books you really see her learning how to use her powers, interacting with the other Grisha, becoming part of the Little Palace pantheon. She really found her place at the Little Palace. She would practice with the other Grisha. She would fling her light across the water and have everybody ooh and ah at it. And I feel like that was a big disconnect with some of the reactors that I was watching who hadn't read the books. They really felt like that she was only at the Little Palace for a week. And they're like, okay, she's been at the palace for a week. She's completely given up on her like lifelong best friend, and she's already got a new guy, and she's perfect at her powers, and it's been a week. Like, there was a line in the show where she's like, it's been months, but especially if you're on your first watch, and if you don't feel the time going by, if there's not even like a montage of her training, then, which there was a montage of Baghra's cabin, hut, cave now, but that could have all been in the space of 1 week. We saw her getting books, we saw her getting hit. We didn't actually see her working with her power once she got it. So that was a section that I definitely wouldn't have cut out. I do understand that the showrunner has come out, or the producer, or somebody big in the show came out, and he was like, yeah, we could have made it 10 episodes instead of 8, but we would have gotten the same budget, so we decided to do 8 with better quality effects and stuff, which I totally understand. But I did feel like it was a weaker part of the story to not really show her in the little palace changing, getting along with the other Grisha, and learning how to control her powers. The show really just stuck to her relationship with Genya in the little palace and how close they got, rather than exploring any other relationships with the other Grisha. We did get a couple of scenes with Marie and Nadia, but they were always relegated to just sparse conversations around the dinner table or once in her chambers. That was pretty much it. We didn't actually get to see much of Marie and Nadia, who they were. They were always just asking Alina questions about herself rather than sharing about themselves, which did carry over the issues that I had with the book, that all the side characters really felt gray and lifeless. We don't know anything about them. We don't know anything about Fedyor, or Nadia, or Marie, or Ivan, or David, or any of the other Grisha that populate the little palace. They're just gray blobs. I actually feel like the books did a better job at having more personality in their side characters. There was that scene where, I can't remember what happened, but there was a scene where it was like winter time, and they all like gathered in the bathhouses, and it was like super hot, so then they went and like rolled around in the snow, and they rushed back to the bathhouses, and it was really cute, and it really gave you the sense that Alina was fitting in finally for once in her life, which I feel like was a really important part of her character development, which they kind of cut in the show. So one of the things that I do like that they changed was at the very end, from the book's perspective, it looked to me like when the Darkling made his big turn and actually used the fold to envelop Novosibirsk, I felt like all of the Grisha, they didn't know his plan initially, but then when he enacted his plans, they were all like, okay, sure, whatever, let's go with it. And that kind of like my brain exploded, and I'm like, really? Not a single Grisha said, I didn't sign up for this? Like, literally, we've been told this the entire time that we're getting rid of the fold, that the Sun Summoner is going to save us by destroying the fold, and now we're expanding it? Like, not a single Grisha had an issue with the Darkling all of a sudden switching plans and doing the exact opposite of what they all thought he was gonna do? What? Like, it wasn't until the next book that we saw that there actually was a fracture in the Grisha. From what we saw in the books, it kind of ended with everybody on the skiff just kind of was like, okay, yeah, this is what we're doing, I guess. So we really did like that we saw in the show that Zoya was there, and she was like, wait, no, this is not what I signed up for. I don't want to do this. And she actively tried to help them get out of the fold, rather than just kind of going along with what the Darkling wanted to do so that Alina could have her moment. Now, in the show, I love how the crows are incorporated into the story, But if I did have a gripe with how they did some of the stuff with the crows, it would be that I felt like their time in the plot kind of took up. They were a little bit too integral to the plot for too long. I really enjoyed when they were away from the main crew in Ketterdam and crossing the fold and trying to get to Alina. I really liked them working towards the goal of getting involved with the main cast, but not quite being there yet. When they actually start interacting with the main plot, I feel like it kind of gets a little shoehorned in. Specifically, I would have preferred if once Alina escapes from them, they would have just said, okay, we're going back to Ketterdam. Go a different way, don't go through the fold. Now you're not on a timetable, so you can go around. You can go south through Shuhan or north through Fjerda. But instead, they decided to get on the skiff that all the main characters were on for the big finale. And I personally feel that that made it so that my favorite part of the Shadow and Bone book could not take place, which is when Alina takes back her Sun Summoner powers from the Darkling, grabs Mal, and they yeet themselves off the skiff, and literally Alina uses the cut, which she actually doesn't do in the TV show. She, in the book, uses the cut to break the skiff in half and leave everybody on the skiff, which was a whole bunch of people, not just like the evil Darklings people, but a whole bunch of people on the skiff, stranded in the middle of the fold to be killed by all the Volcra. I felt like that was such a powerful moment, and a moment where I was like, oh, okay, this is how we're gonna continue the storytelling. Everything isn't always going to be able to be solved where nobody gets hurt. Alina is going to have to make some really tough decisions, and maybe some wrong decisions that are pretty brutal and doom a whole bunch of people. And in the books, this decision to leave everybody on the skiff abandoned in the fold is really something she has to grapple with. She has to grapple with her brutality and her hunger for more power, and why she left everybody there, and those lives that are now on her hands. She has to deal with that. But in the show, because the entire skiff is filled with main characters, she can't do that. We have to get the entire skiff out all safely and soundly with, all of our crows and Zoya successfully out onto the other side, and everybody's all happy, nobody dies except for who are killed by the Darkling. So those were actually my broad general views of how the Book of Shadow and Bone differed from the Netflix's Shadow and Bone series, and the different things I thought the show did better, and some of the things that I thought the show actually didn't do better. So, in the most general sense, moving to the third person so that we can see the Darkling, Mal, and Alina all working separately from each other. We can see things from their point of view, not just Alina's. Really, really strengthened the story, broadened the settings so we could see more of Ravka, and including the crows really added that kind of burst of life that this very serious end of the world, you have to save the world, you are the chosen one story that is the story of the Shadow and Bone trilogy. So even though a lot of the, especially Mal storylines, actually did happen in the books, we didn't get to see them, and seeing them in the show, I think really strengthened both the character of Mal and the story as a whole. In the next video, I'm going to dive into more detail about the specifics of each individual character and how they were changed, or how aspects of them were shown differently in the show than in the movies. I feel like a lot of the changes they made, at least for me, made the character much more compelling than they had been in the book. And again, a lot of this has to do with the fact that we are not stuck inside Alina's head. We have the other people's point of view as well, and not just what Alina thinks of them as. which I think really, really strengthens the story. So I know that this was a very, very long video, and if you aren't interested in the Shadow and Bone TV series or books, I don't know why you're here. I don't know why you're still here, but thank you for watching. And I do hope that this was helpful for you to kind of see, in my own opinion, the breakdown of specifically characters and plots, how the TV show did a lot better job than the book, and some of the aspects of the books that I wish had stayed in, and why, for your writing, having those moments would be very important to character development and making your story a lot deeper and more complex than just the flat, basic, whatever is happening. So I hope that you will stick around for the rest of this series because I'm pretty excited. I have a lot of script that I've been writing. I really hope that you got something out of this and you stick around for it. The next videos in the series, because I have a lot of content, a lot of things to say. When I'm analyzing stories, I have a lot to say. I really like diving into the nitty-gritty of what makes a story work and why, and what are good decisions, what are bad decisions, in my opinion, what makes me more drawn to a character or pushes me away from a character, things like that. So my name is April, this is High Fantasy Writing, and I hope you have a really great rest of the day, and you listen to lots and lots of Shadow and Bone playlists. Bye!